All right, here is our Congress and Presidency review, and the Presidency also includes bureaucracy. Just going to hit the highlights. Make sure that you watch over any videos that you might need special help with vocabulary words. I suggest always Citizen U. They are great, and Hip Hughes has lots of great stuff as well. And then, of course, you have the Crash Course Government series. Real quickly for Congress, make sure that you're able to compare the House and the Senate. Remember that the House is based on population. There are 435 members who serve 2 years, so they're constantly running for re-election. And they also have about a 90% chance of getting re-elected. Senate members only run about a 75% chance of getting re-elected, and they serve for 6 years. They are the upper house. It is based on equal representation. Every state gets 2, so therefore we have 100 members of the Senate. And the House, again, the fact that it is based on population, it does or possibly can change the distribution. Every 10 years when we have a census, then the number of representatives per state can be reapportioned. Then it is up to the state, if they have a change in their number, to redistrict. So remember that reapportionment happens on a larger national level and that redistricting happens on a state level. Redistricting at a state could lead to gerrymandering, where we draw districts to favor a political party to protect an incumbent, or we do kind of clumping where we're trying to get all of the same minority or a party in kind of one area. I remember that Virginia has been guilty of this recently, challenged all the way to the Virginia Supreme Court, and so it had to be redrawn. In order to be a member of the House and the Senate, you have to be a U.S. citizen. There's no naturalization requirement. Whether you have to be native born, that's only for president. And it varies according to state about residency and such. You have to be a little bit older to be in the Senate. Incumbents, the whole incumbency advantage is the whole idea of why people are reelected. If you're already in office, then you're an incumbent. So for example, in our current election for District 5 in Virginia, Robert Hurt was the incumbent, but he's not running for reelection. So we have 2 people who are trying to run against him, and they don't have that advantage. Incumbency advantage means that you can maybe take advantage of something like the franking privilege, which is where you get free postage, which remember that members of the House and Senate cannot use their legislative staff for campaigning, but by sending out mailing and stuff, you're getting your name out there, because name recognition is one of those big incumbency advantages. Also, casework, the fact that you can do so much for your constituents. The things that really hurt incumbents is if there's a big scandal or there's redistricting, the incumbents are likely to get more money from interest groups and such. Most common occupation, members of Congress, is law. Business is second. Bicameralism means that we have 2 houses of Congress, and we have this as a result of the Great Compromise to try to appease both the small and large states in our United States. House Rules Committee is the most important committee in the House, and they set all the rules. Remember that the House has more rules than the Senate because it is so much larger. For example, the filibuster, which again, remember that a lot of the rules in the House and the Senate, they're not in the Constitution. Filibuster, not in the Constitution. This is a tradition that the Senate has. The Senate very much values debate, which is why the filibuster is allowed. They only have 100 members. The House, on the other hand, with 435 members, them all talking all the time, nothing would ever get done. So debate is limited. So the House Rules Committee is important for bills getting passed, what committee they're going to, who's getting time on the floor, and such. The House, in general, party leadership is very important. In both houses, we have majority and minority leaders and party whips who help to make sure we know who's voting for what, that they're voting the right way that their party wants, because there's a lot of pressure to vote with your party. The most important in the House is the Speaker of the House, and then of course we have the majority leader in the Senate, which will be that version of that. Remember that the Vice President is technically head of the Senate, but he's not there that often. He's there to decide a tie. The Senate pro tempore serves in his stead, but who's really kind of controlling things is the majority leader, just like we have the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives. Most work in Congress takes place in committees, and we couldn't get anything done if it wasn't for committees. That's how committees make bills into laws. When I always think about like a great example of an informal amendment, Congress committees is one of the things that I think about, because without congressional committees, bills would never become a law. Committees, make sure you know that standing committees. Make sure you also know conference committee, joint committees, the different types of committees when they're meeting together. Remember that bills they start, just like real quickly, they either start in the House or the Senate. They're read, they go to a committee. If it makes it out of committee, comes back to the floor, is read again, debated, voted on. If it makes it out of that House, it goes to the other one. Starts all over again, the whole entire process. Goes to committee, debated, comes back out, read. If it's not in the same form, then we have to have this conference committee to make sure that it's written in the same form. If it is passed through both houses, then it goes to the president. The president at that point can then decide to sign it. It becomes law. He can decide to veto it. If he vetoes it, it comes back to Congress, and then they have to have 2/3 to override. That takes a supermajority. It's very, very difficult. Just the threat of a veto is often enough not to get a bill passed. Remember that with the president, there are very few laws and bills that ever become laws. When it actually gets to the president, previously it just needed that 50% plus one to pass. The overriding the veto is the 2/3. Sometimes people get confused about that. Make sure you know that the president, speaking of vetoes, also can do a pocket veto, which means he doesn't sign it, but Congress adjourns, so therefore it doesn't become law. And the president does not have the right to line item veto, which Bill Clinton tried to get because he had done that as governor, because most governors have that right, but that is not a right that our president has. He can do signing statements, which can help explain or say why he likes this or doesn't like this. Congress, why is it not representative of the public? When we think about what Congress looks like, it doesn't look like our country. When we think about the average person in Congress, they are white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant males. And they're old. And so why doesn't it look like? We think about the disadvantages for minorities, why it's hard for them to get in, why it's harder for women to get in. We've discussed filibuster and cloture. Remember that senators were originally chosen, they were not directly elected, they were originally chosen by the state legislatures. So all of that changed with the 17th Amendment. Legislative oversight is a very important check that Congress has. This allows them to look over the executive branch, all those different agencies, make sure that they're spending money the way that they should be spending, making sure that they're not doing things they shouldn't be doing. Like, for example, after the incident in Benghazi, Secretary of State at that time, Clinton, was called for to answer for what had happened. That's legislative oversight. We already discussed gerrymandering. Okay, that's Congress in less than 7 minutes. So let's move on to presidents. I've already talked about line item veto. President's options once you received a bill, I've already discussed that. We discussed presidential veto. It's not really used that often, and it can delay anything from getting done, just the threat of it. Who needs Senate confirmation? So remember, the Senate is the upper house, deals more with foreign policy. They have to approve basically all presidential appointments. And right now, for example, the Supreme Court, we're only at 8 because the Senate is holding up and is not actually doing its job and confirming or not confirming President Obama's nomination. All of President Obama's cabinet members, when the new president comes in, their cabinet members will have to be approved by the Senate. The reasons why the president's power has increased over time has a lot to do with crisis, emergency. Like, we think the Civil War, we think about Lincoln, we think about FDR and the Great Depression and World War II, we think about civil rights movement. So we have legislation that came out of Kennedy and Johnson. We think about a lot of things that Nixon tried to do with executive privilege and the War Powers Resolution Act that was meant to limit power because of Vietnam. A War Power Resolution Act, remembers the president does not have the right to declare war. People get confused about that sometimes. Congress has the only one that has power to declare war. Remember, we have not officially declared war since World War II. However, the president can move troops wherever he wants, or she, one day, can move troops wherever they want until they, basically for 30 days until they notified Congress. And they can, they have 48 hours, I believe, or 72 hours to notify Congress. The point is, they have a limitation. And of course, Congress, how could they check that? Well, their biggest check is the power of the purse. Well, it's one of the most important checks. It's hard to say which one is the biggest check. But that idea that they are funding things, that's one way that they can control the president. The president also can issue executive orders. You could say that that's an increase in power because that is an implied power because it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. With the executive orders, though, they do have the force of law versus an executive agreement, which has it basically is like a treaty, but does not require Senate approval. Why do you use an executive order? Why do you use an executive agreement? You want to avoid the kind of red tape that is involved with Congress, and sometimes it could be just to further clarify, or to help a bureaucratic agency do what they need to do. And just like anything, executive orders and executive agreements could be declared unconstitutional by the president. How does public approval of the president affect votes of members of Congress? If the president is more popular, that can help those who are with his party, kind of the same thing. People who try to distance themselves. So after the Affordable Health Care Act didn't go so well, a lot of people were trying to distance themselves who were Democrats from President Obama. The president can gain support a lot of times through the bully pulpit, can actually speak directly to the pulpit, speak directly to the public and address them with his concerns and try to use that influence to try to sway people. The president can be impeached. We've had 2 presidents who have been impeached, both Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Both were found not guilty. Remember, the impeachment is just bringing the actual court proceedings. The House votes whether or not to impeach a president. Then the Senate actually holds the trial. Formal powers of the president. Remember that the president is commander-in-chief. The president can move the military. The president is required to do the State of the Union address. The president is required to enforce the laws as chief administrator. So there's lots of different roles of the president. President is also in charge of meeting with other countries, those kind of things. Informal powers of the president. There's all kinds of things that the president does. Even like something like the bully pulpit can be seen as an informal power of the president. It'd be a good thing to look over the last bit of our PowerPoint if you had some questions about informal powers of the president. President's consideration when seeking a vice president. You want somebody who's going to compliment you, who maybe is going to offer strengths that you don't have. So, for example, a president who's considered, for example, Bush Sr. when he ran, he was older, so he chose a younger running mate. Sometimes they come from a more popular state to hopefully bring in votes. For example, Hillary Clinton choosing Tim Kaine, the fact that he's from Virginia, definitely adds some votes for that. Choosing when John McCain chose Sarah Palin. So again, picking a woman. Those are things that can help to complement you. If you are, when Mitt Romney chose Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney was not considered to be very uber conservative by a lot of people, so Paul Ryan was more conservative, so you might want to pick somebody who kind of matches. You look at Trump's choosing of Mike Pence, somebody who has some of those kind of attributes that he doesn't have. When you discuss the word power resolution, presidential coattails, so when the president gets elected, is very popular. When Reagan, this is a great example. So if you think about like on a tux jacket, you have that part that comes down, that's called the coattails. So when Reagan was elected, tons of other Republicans got in just because people were like that down ticket, voting straight ticket. That's very important. Formal qualifications to be a president. So you got to be of a certain age. You got to be native born citizen. We talked about the difference of that. You got to have been a resident. It's really not that many requirements we think about. Informal requirements, historically it has been that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant with the exception of Kennedy and then with the exception of President Obama. Remember that the president can only serve 2 terms. Since FDR, we've had a constitutional amendment that limited that. So make sure you kind of look over that. And also the order for presidency. For bureaucracy, really just kind of remember what bureaucracy is, that it should be based on merit, that we look at the Pendleton Act and the Hatch Act, those kind of things that ensured that it is based on merit. And the president just can't fire you because he doesn't like you. It has to be because you're not doing your job. And so party loyalty is not supposed to play a big role there. And bureaucrats have that job security because they can't just be fired because the president has changed and is a different political party. And when we think about the budget, the biggest part of our budget is entitlements, things that people are entitled to because they're human, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And then after that, defense is the largest part of our budget. The iron triangle is very important for how bills actually become a law. This is a great example of pluralism, like how we would like it to work. Remember though, many people argue that our country is actually hyper-pluralist and not pluralist. So on the iron triangle, so we have congressional committees, Then we have interest groups, and then we have bureaucratic agencies. So let's say, for example, that we were trying to pass a law about the environment. So our bureaucratic agency that would be there would be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And then the interest group that could be very different ones. It could be Greenpeace, it could be whatever. Let's say that the bill actually related to car emissions. So the EPA is going to be there, but not only would maybe Greenpeace be there, but also somebody who represents the car companies as an interest group, their corporations would also send somebody. And they're giving information, and they're trying to influence how that bill is actually being put into law, because there are all those little details that are coming. And so the idea that they all kind of work with each other. Make sure you know your checks and balances. I don't know if this is backwards, but this is on your study guide. Just kind of some examples. Make sure you are aware of them. Practice your FRQs. Think about things that make good short answers. Study. That is my best advice for you. Good luck.